Welcome, everyone, to the High Performance Legal Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Arkbell, president and founder of Prevail Legal Marketing. And today we have Dan Garrison with us. Dan is the managing director of Fresh Start Funding. And Fresh Start Funding helps attorneys grow their practices by offering payment plans to clients who can't pay upfront fees. They offer everything attorneys need to offer payment plans to their clients, including financing, so the attorney gets paid first, payment management so attorneys aren't chasing clients for fees, and proven marketing support to attract and retain more clients. Dan, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So Dan and I have known each other for several years. And Dan, I want to start. Why don't you give us a bit of background about yourself and your history in the legal career before we get into Fresh Start Funding?
Sure. Yeah. So I am a recovering attorney. I practiced for about 25 years, primarily in corporate restructuring. I started out my career in big law, working for and as a partner in some really large firms. And then for about the last 10 years of my legal career, I actually had my own firm that was kind of a boutique business law practice, focused a lot on my corporate restructuring practice, but handled all kinds of other business law issues too. And then a number of years ago, I actually started a consumer bankruptcy brand called the Turnaround Team, and had in mind trying to build a national consumer bankruptcy platform before I partnered up with an old friend of mine, Matt Hartley, who's now my co-founder and co-managing director here at Fresh Start Funding. And that adventure started about 3.5 years ago, I guess now. So
Nice. So you were in corporate law and you went out on your own. And then why did you decide to start the Turnaround Team when you were doing corporate restructuring?
well, it's interesting because my practice was actually doing really well. I'd gotten some national attention for some of the work that I'd done, and I think to all outward appearances, my attorney friends would have thought I was crazy for leaving my practice at the point that I did. But it was a combination of a couple things. One was that in a law practice, you're building an income business. You really don't build any sort of equity in the business itself. And I kind of had an epiphany, honestly, that the day I stopped generating business and the day I stopped driving strategy for the firm ceased to be a business. And that was kind of troubling to me. So I really kind of focused in on the business side of things and recognized an opportunity. And this is the second part of the puzzle, I guess. And that is that consumer attorneys in particular struggle with the business side of their firms, whether it's the marketing piece, which of course, Adam, you're intensely familiar with, or cash flow and managing sort of the business side of the firm. And so my buddy Matt Hartley and I compared notes about 4.5 years ago and realized that we were both seeing a need in the marketplace to help consumer attorneys build their practices by helping more people. And that really was the genesis of Fresh Start Funding. We launched in February of 2018, primarily in the consumer bankruptcy space, and really built the business on that backbone. And we have, over the last 1.5 years or so, now expanded really aggressively into other consumer law areas too. And we're really helping consumer attorneys across the entire spectrum of services that they offer.
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk a lot about that. You mentioned something. You said you had an epiphany that when you stopped working, then your business would stop, more or less.
Yeah.
So did something prompt that? What was the genesis of that? Or that's a big change in your business and life?
Honestly, maybe epiphany is not the right word. I guess the final realization felt a little bit like an epiphany. It was more sort of a slow burning realization, I guess, over my career. It sort of chafed at me because I had always been sort of entrepreneurial. I had started a couple of businesses from scratch before I went to law school, and actually took a hiatus from my practice to run a big wholesale company through a turnaround and a debt workout and equity restructuring about 15, 16 years ago. And so I'd always kind of had in mind that people who ran other types of businesses were typically looking to build up enterprise value. And that was difficult to do. Not impossible in the consumer space, actually, but difficult to do generally as a practicing attorney. And so, that slow burning realization kind of built up to the point where, in my early 50s, I went, hey, it's kind of silly to keep spinning my wheels on a billable hour basis, when what I can do is take that same time and build something that helps a whole bunch of other people, and in the process, build some enterprise value for the company too. And interestingly, the parallel is pretty strong between our message to consumer attorneys through Fresh Start funding, which is, do well by doing good. You can grow your practice by making yourself accessible and affordable to more people. So there's kind of a nice parallel, if you will, between that realization that I had about my own business life and then what we're trying to accomplish now, for what's now about 600 law firms nationally that we work with.
Someone listening to this might be thinking what you were thinking 5 years ago, about the billable hour and, maybe just wanting something a little bit different. So how is running a business like Fresh Start Funding different than running your law firm?
Well, honestly, it doesn't have to be completely different. And I guess that's one of the things that we talk about with attorneys all the time is that if you can really dial in what it takes to generate clients, so get your marketing very dialed in and get good systems and processes in place and have a good handle on your cash flow. And, if you're doing, what we advocate, which is offering payment terms to clients to make yourself accessible to more people, dialing in that process as well, you can kind of build a bit of a widget factory in a consumer practice where you can focus on doing the things that you do best, which is providing, the top end kind of legal services, and really be an entrepreneur and a business owner that has something that sort of transcends your ability to grind out, the next 6 minutes or the next hour of your life as a billable hour professional. So the parallels are actually pretty strong. The difference is that we're kind of at this level where we're trying to work with, hundreds of firms to get that message out and to help them grow. And so kind of creating exponential growth, if you will, through the vision that we have for how you can grow consumer bankruptcy and consumer law practices in general.
Right. And so you said you and your partner had a realization that there was this gap in the market. What was the triggering point of seeing that opportunity? Was it, were you guys like sitting down having dinner? How did that like genesis of an idea come about?
So Matt and I have known each other for over 20 years. We crossed paths at a couple big firms in the past, and I think mutually we just saw each other as one of those people that we ought to stay in touch with. And so every year or so we would get together and just kind of compare notes and catch up socially. And that accelerated a bit, in the couple years before Fresh Start Funding, where we started having lunch, every few months and talking about what was going on in the consumer bankruptcy space. Because Matt had gone from being a real estate and finance attorney to being a private lender to doing some workout and turnaround work. And then ultimately he built a consumer bankruptcy practice that in the space of 3 years, he grew it to be the largest in Arizona and one of the larger ones in the entire country. And so he was seeing firsthand, as I was on a smaller scale, how difficult it was to attract clients after the big boom cycle of bankruptcies, tapered off, following the Great Recession. And he had discovered this way of structuring bankruptcy engagements that allowed you to offer payment terms to folks who were filing Chapter 7 bankruptcies. And he was working with a company that was out in the market at that point in time that had sort of the seed of the idea of what became Fresh Start Funding. The problem was they were executing on it really, really poorly. And in my entrepreneurial experience, and I'm sure you probably have seen this too, there's two critical pieces to a successful business. One is having the right idea, and then the second is executing on it really well. And this other company wasn't executing on what we thought was a good idea. So we, there's a joke in the law that plagiarism is the highest form of flattery. So we basically took that kernel of an idea that this other company had developed, that we could offer financing and payment management to consumer bankruptcy attorneys. And we said, we can improve on that model and then we can execute it excellently. And so, that was sort of the genesis of it. We did, a round of private equity, dog and pony shows to, come up with some capital to launch the company. And actually, we're really gratified that the first few folks that we talked to not only all said yes, but they actually entered into kind of a bidding war to be, private equity sponsor of the company, which was great. It was a nice corroboration, that the idea we had was good. And we both wound down our practices at the same time. Matt ended up selling his consumer bankruptcy practice. I ended up just kind of winding down my firm and making sure all my people landed well, which they did, which was great too. And then we jumped, both feet directly into Fresh Start funding at the beginning of 2018.
Yeah. So beginning of 2018. So you wind down your firms, you received funding, now you're ready to get started. I'm just sort of curious, what's the first thing that you do? I mean, because you have people collecting money, you've got a technology platform, I believe. You need to get clients. So who was your first client, and what did those first couple months look like as you got it off the ground?
So our first client was actually Matt's firm. So, we kind of had our first client in our pocket when we started because he was in the process of marketing his firm to sell it. And he had somebody that was able to run it day to day so that he could spend his time on our new company. And so our first bit of business came from his firm, and then very quickly after that, we started developing clients. And as you noted, the business really has two kind of key components. We have sort of our sales and marketing function, which is about bringing on attorneys, introducing them to our program, helping shepherd them through the process of incorporating what we do into their business flow. And then once they start, financing cases and offering payment terms to their clients, we handle the payment management. And so we've got a really robust operations group that is involved in helping those folks stay on track and making their payments and handling all the kind of back office functions that go along with that. So we simultaneously, hired someone to help with sales and someone to help with operations. And it was almost something like you'd see, in movies when you talk about startups. We rented a little corporate suite space, had an office that was probably 12 by 15, and we set up card tables along the walls and had, computer stations there with folding chairs. And the first probably 5 months of the company, was spent, shoulder to shoulder, literally, with everybody getting things going. And then in September of 19, we moved into some some purpose-built space that we have for the company, and we've now got between 25 and 30 employees, spread across our different groups in the company.
Yeah, what a great story, great founding story.
It had its high moments and its low moments, like most entrepreneurial stories do. But yeah, it's been a good ride. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I worked out of coffee shops for a year, and then I found an office that was way too big for me, and I quote unquote leased half of the office. But it doesn't make any sense because no one's going to lease the other half of the office. So I think there was like this piece of tape down the middle of it that was like my half, and I had an IKEA desk in it. And it's this huge office with just me. And anyway, so those early stories are always fun. Yeah.
No, and the entrepreneurial journey is really interesting, and one of the things we've discovered working with law firms is that they're entrepreneurs, and many of them don't realize it. Honestly, they don't realize that that's what they fundamentally are when they own their own firms, and they're either a solo practitioner or a very small firm practitioner. And I think that there's a tendency sometimes for these smaller shops to focus, on the lawyer part of it, which of course they have to do. That's the core offering, is the legal services. But they're either not prepared for or not aware of the needs that they have on the business side. And I teach law practice management and leadership to law students. I'm an adjunct professor at my old law school. And, I'm really focused on trying to help attorneys recognize that being a lawyer, at least outside of a larger firm kind of a structure, is just as much about being a business person as it is about being a good lawyer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like so many, the E-Myth where you start off with your craft and then you move into, managing leadership. And it's, I think I do a lot of podcast interviews and things, and there's kind of like this common sentiment of like, well, lawyers aren't necessarily business people, but that's just the same in every other startup environment. Everyone's good at their craft. They're not a business person, and they have to become a business person.
For sure. And the best of the firms that we work with either start out having that awareness, or they develop that awareness, with a little bit of nudging and education. And I'll tell you, there's no greater feeling than working with a firm that's been struggling, to make ends meet. They're worried about making payroll, paying the rent, let alone taking home a check and paying their own bills. And we see them double, triple. Anecdotally, I worked with firms that have grown 5x, 6x over the course of less than a year by focusing on what it is that clients really need, which is an affordable, accessible solution to the problem that they're having.
Right. Well, so you initially started primarily in bankruptcy, right?
Correct.
And
Yeah.
and then talk about that mainly going to bankruptcy, then the pandemic hits, and talk about the last 18 months that you've been experiencing.
Yeah, so it's funny because most folks outside of the bankruptcy world, when we talk to them about the idea that we were basically providing financing for folks who were filing bankruptcy and then trying to collect fees from them, just had this incredulous reaction, like, why would you be in that space? Like, that seems like the riskiest, hardest space that you could be in. Um, and in some ways it is. I mean, it's highly regulated, and we have to structure engagements a little bit differently in the bankruptcy space. It's much easier in immigration, domestic, criminal defense, that sort of thing. So we cut our teeth in some tough space. But on the financial or the economic side of it, the interesting thing is that the biggest risk in consumer finance is that your consumer is going to go out and file bankruptcy and discharge the debt. But having just filed a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, all the folks that whose payments we were managing weren't eligible to file a bankruptcy for 8 years. And we layered in an interesting twist too, that because we have economy of scale and we're sort of in the finance space, we could report to the credit bureaus. And so a big selling point in the bankruptcy space for us was that the instant they filed bankruptcy and then started making payments to their attorney, they would start rehabilitating their credit.
Mm.
And even more interestingly, it turns out there's two key components to your FICO score. One is revolving credit, and the other is installment credit. And for folks coming out of bankruptcy, they can usually get into some revolving credit within a year or so, but it's really tough for them to get an installment loan. And we report as an installment loan, so we provide kind of a key piece for them to recover their creditworthiness. And so that's been really attractive to attorneys that work with us because it's attractive to their clients as well. So we started out in bankruptcy, as I said, and really for the first almost 2 years of the business, we're exclusively there. And then about a year and a half ago, we recognized that what we did could just as easily be, transposed into other consumer law areas. And so about 35% of our business now, and that figure's growing monthly, is outside of the bankruptcy space. And it's everything from domestic to criminal defense to immigration, timeshare exit, whole host of different things. Because the guiding principle is still the same, which is consumers expect and prefer to have payment terms to pay their attorneys, but they need what they need right now. They need whatever that relief is immediately. And so rather than making payments to the attorney before they can get the help, we turn that on its head and make it possible for them to get the help they need immediately and then pay for it over time.
And what practice areas do you see work best for your financing? We talked about bankruptcy, but what other ones tend to do well?
Any practice area that involves a flesh and blood person who is going to be charged a flat fee for the service that they're getting works for us. The only other requirement is we're all electronic, and so they have to have some method of making the payments, so debit cards or ACH transactions, that sort of thing. There are some practice areas that have already kind of embraced the idea of flat fees. So consumer bankruptcy is definitely one that operates typically on flat fees. But first-time DUI, non-aggravated DUI defense, a lot of basic domestic services, and uncontested divorce, support modification, custody modifications, those sorts of things. We've discovered timeshare exit is a big flat fee practice where folks are saddled with a timeshare that they thought were going to be a was going to be a positive thing, and it turns out to be kind of this negative annuity that they can never get rid of. Um, Immigration, almost all the immigration services are flat fee services. Typically, if you want to modify a visa status or something like that, an immigration attorney will quote you a flat fee. And my company works anywhere from $1,000 to $7,500 and offers between 12 and 18-month payment terms under our program. And so we convert, what would be, say, a couple $1,000 upfront expense to file, a bankruptcy or to file a support modification petition or something like that into, $35 a week that we take out on Friday when they get their paycheck, or, $120 a month for 12 months. Which, it's interesting. For those of us that can afford to write checks for services, affordability is about price. But for folks who can't afford to write a check, affordability is about terms. And so converting that big chunk of money that most folks don't have into affordable payments that they could manage is a night and day difference for them.
That's an interesting mindset that I've never heard of or thought about. That affordability, if you can pay for it, is about the price, but if you can't pay for it, it's about the terms.
Yep.
Makes
That's exactly right. And the fact is, even though I say, those of us who can afford to write a check think about price, think about the last car you bought or buying a house. I mean, the fact is, even folks who are relatively affluent and have good incomes still rely on terms for large purchases. And it just happens that for a large segment of our population, they don't have enough money to put 4 new tires on their car to buy a new water heater for their house. And so suddenly a $1,500, $2,000, $5,000 unexpected legal expense is, it might as well be $5 million to them. They just don't have the money to pay it up front. And for the attorneys, operating in this space, they're in a dilemma because they'd like to have that client sign up with them. But if that client can't pay up front, then that attorney, who's essentially running a very small business, is essentially also becoming a bank, where they're providing financing, and they don't have the cash flow or the capital reserves to float that so that they can still pay their bills, and they don't have the infrastructure to manage the payments. And so, one of the analogies that I use all the time when I speak about these things is, if you offer, 10 people a month payment terms on their engagement, over the course of a year, you're going to have 120 people that are making payments to you if you offer 12-month payment terms, which is what our program's about. And they make payments as much as weekly because they get paid weekly. And so on a monthly basis, you're looking to manage 500 payments. And while we'd like to think, you just basically automate that and the payments come in, that's not actually the case. At least 20% of the payments the first time you try them don't clear. And so what we add is a very personalized human touch to that, coupled with automations so that we can keep them on track through positive messaging and stuff like that. And the average small firm attorney just can't support that kind of effort. They don't have the skill, they don't have the technology, they don't have the time and resources to chase it. But once we centralize it and work, with hundreds of law firms, we can offer the just world-class payment management services as part of the package for them.
Now, as attorneys that are looking to do the right thing for their clients, kind of what immediately comes to my mind is, collections, even though you're not, you're collecting money, but it's the opposite of what you're trying to do, right? So someone's payment doesn't clear. What does that look like with your team's follow-up? Is it phone call? What is the type of, you said positive collection, something.
Sure. So we talk about it in terms of relationship-based payment management. So when a consumer enters our system, so an attorney offers payment terms, they get some financing from us to accommodate that, and they turn over the account to us to manage. The first thing that happens is that we reach out for what we call a welcome call. And so one of our staff talks to the person on the phone and says, "Hey, we're Fresh Start Funding. You remember your attorney mentioned that we would be working with you to get your payments made. I just want to confirm information to make sure that our files are correct. Want to make sure that the schedule that you were set up on is one that fits your lifestyle. Do you get paid weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, monthly, whatever? And they make sure that the person knows going into it exactly how things are going to work. And then every time a payment's due, 2 days beforehand, they get a text and an email that just reminds them that the payment's going to be coming out of their account and invites them that if there's any difficulty, that all they need to do is log in through our online portal or call our staff, and we can work with them. And then, assuming they make the payment, they get a thank you message, a receipt essentially for the payment. If they miss the payment, so let's say we try to bring that payment in through a debit card transaction and it doesn't clear, the first thing that happens is an automation where they get a message that's essentially, oops, something is wrong, your payment didn't clear, log on, if you need to change your debit card number or something like that. And then if that doesn't generate a result, and it does a fair amount of the time actually, then the next day there's a phone call that goes out to them, and the messaging is very sort of soft. We're not a collection company, because if it gets to the point where an account's seriously distressed, we turn it back over to the attorney, because a lot of attorneys are very sensitive to not wanting heavy-handed tactics used on their clients, let alone turn over to a collection agency or someone being sued or something like that. So our messaging is very soft. It's, hey, remember, we're part of you getting a fresh start, and we want to help you stay on track. What's going on with you right now? And you can imagine during the pandemic, a lot of times it was, hey, I just got laid off from the hotel that I was working at, or my hours have been cut and I'm struggling to make my payment. And our basic rule of thumb is that as long as they communicate with us, and we believe that they're making an honest effort to try and get back on track, we don't report negatively to the credit bureaus for them, and we'll modify the payment terms to kind of fit their current situation. And it doesn't cost the attorneys anything more to do that, and it doesn't cost the consumers anything more to do that. That's just all built into sort of our business model, that we work with these folks because we've discovered that that method of working with them to bring in the payments is ultimately more successful than the heavy-handed tactics. And we're always looking. There are statistics published nationally by Clio and some other companies that have very broad reach in terms of data. And the average consumer attorney that manages their own payments collects between 72 and 80 cents on the dollar. And because of our relationship-based approach, we're collecting 92 cents on the dollar. And the net effect of that is that we essentially pay for a good share of our services through our improved results.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, clearly people have a lot of times a negative perception of attorneys, but in everyone that I talk to, the empathy side from the attorney to the consumer is always really high. And the fact that it goes really delinquent, you turn it back to the attorney so that they can manage that with the client, I think is great, because what if you took the heavy-handed approach like other collection agencies, that's what they're getting away from,
Yeah.
right? It's like, so then to do that is a little insane.
Yeah, I know when I was in practice, the last thing I ever wanted to do was turn a client over to collections or have to sue a client, because it was more or less an invitation for that client to complain about my services to the bar, or to complain about something else. And most attorneys know that their insurers, their malpractice insurers, ask them every year, do you sue clients? Because it turns out that's a risk factor for attorneys in their practices.
Now, everyone listening to this is probably thinking, like, how does the flow of money work? How much does it cost? Can you just talk a little bit about how the flow of money works for the attorney, how they get paid, and just some of those basic economic components?
Sure. So what we do is we set the attorney up on a line of credit so that they have an ability to draw against the receivables. It's essentially a form of asset-based lending. And so every time they offer payment terms to a client, they upload their engagement agreement and a couple of other items that we require. It's very light touch in the client portal that we have online. And then my team looks at it to tick off a couple of very simple boxes in underwriting, and we fund twice a week. And so typically within 2 business days of the time that they submit a draw request, they get an electronic deposit into their bank account. for their initial advance, which is 65% of the face amount of the receivable. And then another 10% of it goes into kind of a pooled risk fund for the attorney so that there's a hedge there if some of the clients don't pay, which has turned out to be just a very effective way of managing the risk for the attorney, given that we're collecting 92%, their money on a regular basis. And then the remaining 25% is our fee for the financing, the payment management, the credit reporting. Depending on the practice area, there's a lot of marketing assistance, a lot of practice management assistance. We're launching something called Practice Accelerator here in the next month that's going to involve almost like an EO style experience, which Adam and I are very familiar with, where attorneys will be able to work with each other and lean on each other a bit for sort of collaborative learning and experience sharing and stuff like that we're going to proctor for them. So we're doing a lot more than just the financing. It really, it's about the rising tide that floats all boats. I mean, if our attorney clients are doing well, we expect to be doing well also. So anything that we can do to help them build their practices and become better business people ultimately helps us out too.
So you said earlier that typical collections for consumer attorneys was 75?
It goes from low 70s up to about 80%, depending on the practice area. So bankruptcy is about 72%. Domestic, criminal, some of the other areas are in the 70s up to the very low 80s. And that's if they're devoting a fair amount of time and resources to the collection effort. If they're just letting it sit, I mean, it gets much worse than that.
Yeah. So even though you're taking a percentage, the net impact is not that large because you're managing things.
Yeah, our goal is to try and honestly to pay for ourselves in large part by the better results. And honestly, the right perspective I think on this is not to focus on the percentage that our fee represents for the services. Really, the bottom line perspective makes more sense, which is about growth. So the reason the firms that work with us do so well is that there's just this huge untapped, population of people out there that can't afford to hire them, whether they know it or not. I mean, sometimes people will be honest and say, hey, I just can't figure out how I'm going to come up with the money to pay you. But more often than not, the attorney spends time in a consultation with that prospective client. And the client says, hey, thanks very much for your time. We need to think about this a little bit. We'll be back in touch. And what the attorney doesn't know is that is code for, I don't know how I could possibly afford to pay you. And they're just embarrassed to talk about it that way. So when the attorney offers an option, says, look, here's how this works. It's going to cost a bit of money to, get the work that you need done. And you have two choices. You can pay up front, and if you do, it's going to cost you this price. And if you need to make payments, then I've got a program where, for as little as $0 down, we can get going with the work that you need, and you can make payments over time for 12 months. And I have seen this happen in real life and in real time, the relief that washes over people's faces when they realize that they can get what they need from this attorney that they like and that they're inclined to trust, but who's smart enough to figure out that they need payment terms to be able to afford the services. And so, when you grow your practice, double your practice, the idea of paying a company like mine a modest fee to facilitate that ends up being the smartest thing that an attorney can do. It's like in your world, right? If you know that it costs a certain amount of money to acquire a client, and that's a manageable amount of money, they ought to be giving you more and more money to grow their practices, because it's not an expense, it's an investment in building a client base. And it's the same thing here.
Yeah. Now, I've actually spoken to quite a few bankruptcy attorneys about this type of zero down, sort of approach. And a common response revolves around ethics. Mm-hmm. And this is not my area of expertise, but I know it is yours. What is the sort of ethical implication around it? And what has, your company done to kind of address that or research it? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the bankruptcy space, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking, is really highly regulated. There's a division of the Department of Justice called the United States Trustee Program that's essentially watchdog over bankruptcy. And like most institutions, they're kind of resistant to change. And it's been the last several years where a method of structuring the engagement called bifurcation has started to take hold. And this is basically the idea of splitting your engagement into two pieces so that you have one agreement for the work that needs to be done to start the bankruptcy, and then you have a separate agreement for the work that's required to complete the bankruptcy. And the fee that we finance and that the attorneys collect over time is that post bankruptcy or post filing fee. And there's been a lot of case law that's developed over the last few years looking at this and figuring out how it fits within the bankruptcy system and figuring out how it fits within the attorney's rules of ethics. And we continue to get positive decisions. There was one that just came out of the Southern District of Florida a week and a half ago that reconfirmed what other cases before it had said, which is that as long as you disclose this very robustly to the client, they understand, for example, that if you're offering two options that have two different price tags associated with them, that they're very clear on that, and that they consent clearly to working with somebody outside who's going to get a bit of their private information, to manage the payments, that this is all doable under the bankruptcy code and under the rules of professional responsibility for attorneys. We actually have got an outside national ethics council that we've worked with every step of the way in our program to make sure that we're conforming to the ethics rules. I mean, Matt and I, we're both attorneys. I mean, we have, it's embarrassing to do this math now, but I think we've got about 55 years of legal experience between the two of us and reputations and that we care very much about. So we were intensely concerned with making sure that what we do, conforms to the ethics rules. And while it's only one state, we've actually gotten an ethics opinion from the Arizona Supreme Court, about the program that is in draft stage right now, but should be finalized here really shortly. That kind of walks through all the rules, and we've got all those resources too. So, one of the things that we feel strongly about too is that we like to share what we know with other people, whether they're doing business with us or not. And we set up a landing page for folks that are viewing this podcast that will give them access to some of those resources. And we've got what we call Fresh Start University, which is a part of our website where we keep copies of all the cases and ethics opinions and a lot of resource materials and stuff like that. And we're happy to make those things available. But the landing page we set up for folks who are watching this podcast is freshstartfunding.com/prevail. And so anyone who's listening to this can log on and they can see some of our case studies. And we've actually also got a practice calculator that helps them with the idea of, where should I set a flat fee if I'm going to be offering payment terms? Kind of gives them some concrete guidance about that.
Yeah. And I'll drop that in the show notes of the podcast and the description of the YouTube video so people can easily get there.
We're also just kind of big nerds too, I'll be honest with you. So, if somebody has questions and they want to noodle around some of this stuff, we try and make ourselves available. And we do a lot of webinars and things like that, just as you do, to try and get the word out about how all this works.
Yeah, perfect. All right, last couple questions. You mentioned, and it's about the future. So part one is sort of about just the future of your industry, if you think anything's going to change in the financing piece. And then the second one is I just want to learn a little, when you said kind of like EO, I think it was called Practice Accelerator. Mm-hmm. I think is what you said. I would just want to hear a little bit more about that. But as far as the financing industry, do you see anything changing in the next couple of years, or it kind of seems like you've kind of been the one to change it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, we are change agents. There's no question about that. And particularly in the bankruptcy space, that's involved me speaking and writing nationally. And I've actually also been litigating, so when the attorneys that are in the bankruptcy space have had questions raised by the United States Trustee's Office, we step right in and we represent them and bring that national perspective and all the resources that we have to bear on helping the trustees and the judges understand why this is all, legal and ethical. It's interesting. Certainly in the bankruptcy space, everybody's crystal balls have been kind of broken lately. As anyone who's watching this podcast that's in the bankruptcy space knows, it's been a really rough year through COVID. Bankruptcies have fallen by about half. And we definitely see a recovery happening in the bankruptcy space over the next several months. Looking at historic statistics, there's probably 350,000 Chapter 7 bankruptcies that should have been filed in the last 16 months that haven't been. And we were already kind of at historic static lows in that space. So I definitely see things happening there. More broadly in the consumer finance space, a lot of what we're involved in is education and awareness, educating attorneys about the fact that there are options out there if their clients can't afford to pay their fee up front, and helping them to understand how to do that. And particularly since we've only been involved in these other practice areas for a little over a year, that awareness, is still growing. And so I definitely see an expansion there. And then, for our company, it's not just the legal industry that we have our eyes on. I mean, we definitely will, at some point in the not too distant future, expand outside of the legal industry too, and start working in healthcare and home services and some other areas as well, because the same challenges exist there for consumers as exist when they need an attorney. So we, despite having had to fight through this last year with all of the COVID effects, we're positioned really well, and we're very optimistic about the growth of our company and the growth of the industry just generally. More and more consumers are savvy about the fact that, they need to shop for the most affordable solution. And as we talked about earlier, that's not always just about price. Folks are actually happy to pay a bit more at the bottom line if they can make, payments on that over time in a way that's manageable for them. So interesting stuff happening there. And then, on Practice Accelerator, we kind of touched on EO, and Adam, you mentioned we've known each other for a long time, and we met through Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a collaborative learning organization for entrepreneurs. And the core kind of structure of EO is this idea of a forum, which is that you join a small group of people who become your confidential outside advisors for your company that you can share really anything with. Because being an entrepreneur is an isolating, lonely kind of an experience, right? Most of us don't have someone that we can share our greatest fears and challenges with, or whose brains we can pick for potential solutions and experiences, that those folks might have had. And so we're trying to create within our company sort of a smaller version of that same experience where, the typical bankruptcy attorney or consumer law attorney in general may not want to talk about their business very much with their friend down the street who's also their competitor. But if we could organize a group that kind of crosses geographic boundaries and get some gray-haired folks in there and some younger folks in there and kind of share those different perspectives and experiences, especially with some guidance initially from our staff who understands the challenges and stuff like that, we think we can create a really good experience that's going to facilitate growth. And I don't need to convince you of this. I mean, the EO experience is really transformational for a lot of people. Just that idea that you can, work with like-minded, people who are looking to grow their businesses is it facilitates success in such a big way for people. So we want to try and emulate that a little bit within the consumer law area and give people that same sort of experience.
Yeah. Yeah, the EO has completely changed my business, and it's the like-mindedness, and then I think that coupled with confidentiality are two huge pieces that drive it. And I mean, you probably don't know this, but in our chapter here in Arizona, I a couple years ago started an agency mastermind group where we pulled together 8 or 10 marketing agencies in the Phoenix area for just the reasons that you're describing. And a lot of us competed with each other, actually. We would compete on the same projects. We'd win and lose clients with each other. But we would talk about all sorts of things together as it related to processes and our pitch decks, and just hearing how other people did things, hearing how they structured their agreements, hearing what their services looked like was incredible. It was amazing. And so, that's a unique instance where we're all in EO together. We know each other. We trust each other, even if we're sharing confidential things. So there's probably not that level of trust right away in a new group. But if you're out of state, then it's a different thing and massively beneficial, especially if you're in the same practice area or something like that. So I can see that. going?
Yeah, we're working hard on getting that launched. We've got the curriculum developed, and I'm kind of developing some of the curriculum in parallel with my law practice management and leadership classes that I teach to law students. Kind of killing two birds with one stone. Um, and we hope to have our first cohort of attorneys organized and meeting within the next couple of months. So definitely something to watch there, and we're going to be really interested to see how it benefits the folks who participate, because it's an investment of time for sure, to do something like that. But you pick up one good tip, every conversation or more, that you can implement in your practice, and it's maybe one of the most beneficial investments of time you ever make.
Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more about Practice Accelerator, Fresh Start Funding you, what are the best ways for them to get in touch and find you?
So, as I said, we got a landing page set up for folks who are watching, this podcast, that will give them immediately access to some real resources. I mean, these aren't sales materials; these are actual things that we think will help them think about the practices and plan for their growth. And that again is freshstartfunding.com/prevail. And then more generally, if they just go to the website, which is freshstartfunding.com, they can access a lot of information there. They can fill out an information request, and one of my business consultants will follow back up with them. Uh, uh, and there's also a toll-free number on the website that they can call if they want to get in touch with us right away to talk about things. And we really do have a consultative kind of approach. If somebody's unsure whether or not a flat fee kind of approach will work for them and what the economics might look like for their practice, we'll spend time with them to try and unpack how their practice works and give them our best sense of how this would fold into what they're doing right now and what they could expect. But I'll tell you, 3.5 years into this now, um, I can tell you that the success stories are many. Attorneys that suddenly offer a solution for the biggest challenge that their prospective clients have are just going to reap rewards from that. And again goes back to the guiding principle that we have, which is do well by doing good. Grow your practice by helping people that couldn't otherwise afford to hire you. It's the easiest thing in the world to solve that problem for them.
Yeah. Great, Dan. Thanks so much for joining us. We
Thanks,
appreciate
Adam.
it. And for everyone else, we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.